Hello and welcome. My name is Tiffany Farag and welcome to Get to Know You Cafe. In my mission to open conversations and access deeper dialogue, I wanted to hear from you listeners on last week's question and discussion. Last week's podcast, when Callie and I discussed the question, can a person be disconnected from other humans and still be healthy? We received a number of responses that further deepen dialogue. Joining us today on the Get to Know You Cafe is Emily from an upcoming podcast. Welcome, Emily.
Welcome. How's it going today?
Very well, thank you. Glad to have you on the cafe.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Earlier, you were given the topic from last week's podcast to reflect, and you've also listened to the episode. Prior to listening to the different responses, what are your thoughts on the discussion?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting discussion right now for multiple reasons. You know, a lot of the world has actually been isolated, I think, for a longer period of time than ever before. And now a lot of the world is experiencing like mass gatherings and coming together in a really interesting and evocative way. So I think this is a really timely discussion, and it's important to remember a lot of the takeaways from that episode as we start gathering again.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. What are some takeaways, I guess, that you took from that episode?
Yeah, I think essentially I agree with your guest thesis that we do require interaction from other human beings, but it is definitely a nuanced discussion. I had also heard about those studies that they did actually in Russia about touch deprivation on children and how it affects our psychology. And it's interesting now that we have so much technology, and I was just reading another article about remote work in the New York Times and what the future is of remote work, and how people are getting things like Zoom fatigue, where we're trying to interact with people in a whole new way, but our bodies aren't quite used to how we interact digitally.
Sure.
And it's actually creating even more mental fatigue for us.
Really? I did not know that. So would you like this mental fatigue is kind of like, do you think is associated now with, are we becoming disconnected even though we're trying to connect so much through Zoom?
Yeah, I think this is the paradox of technology, because obviously we can reach someone across the world in a matter of seconds at this point. But technology in all its glory is still fairly primitive compared to our brains. It really is. Our brains are amazing machines. And so as we adapt these new technologies, you know, in the instance of Zoom, it is the fact that in order for us to look like we're paying attention, you actually have to look into the camera. However, when you look into the camera, you're not actually looking at the people who are displayed on the screen. And so you're not picking up those visual cues. And and you're also extremely close to the screen, which is not usually how we interact with humans. We have some sort of personal space
Sure.
that kind of radiates around us.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point that you said there. Like, you know, what I'm thinking of when I'm Zooming now with people, like I'm trying to I don't know, I feel like if I'm looking at the camera, I'm looking at their eyes, but I'm not. Their eyes are on the screen. So I need to look at the screen. It's like, yeah, that's absolutely right. And then you have this dissociation, like it's not, it's almost like we're not really present.
Yeah, and it's also so many factors that come together. It's like not making that eye contact, not being able to read signals, the personal space issue. And then we as humans also find staring threatening, like most animals find staring a threat response.
Yeah, it's
And
definitely like that in many cultures. But then with like, in the Japanese culture, if you look someone in the eye, it's very rude.
right, right. But we are now attempting to do that all the time just to appear like we're paying attention, which is very interesting because in meetings, usually in the work world, we're not paying attention, and it's not expected that you would, like literally stare at the person across from the conference room.
No,
So
that's a good
we're
point.
connecting. Yeah. We're definitely connecting in whole new ways, and it's very interesting. It'll be very interesting to see the next generation of technology. The article was also talking about advancements in glasses, so we can feel like we're much more in like an AR type environment, that person is actually in the room with us, which is much more the way that person would be displayed would be much more natural to actually interacting as a human. So we're rocketing into the future here. It's very
Yeah,
interesting.
maybe it can work in our favor, like technology. Like I know it, like it kind of, I guess it hinders many connections. But yeah, like you said, it's like they're progressing and developing new things. Like I think someone mentioned, or I've read something somewhere about, those maybe like emotional bracelets or something like that, where you're able to feel somebody else's emotion as you're speaking
Mm,
to them.
yeah.
Like I think that would be
Yeah.
great. We should be on all of our hands, whatever, if that's possible. Like, just to know what someone else is feeling.
Yeah, definitely. I think something like that. It's weird because as humans, we develop these systems. I think no matter what. At one of my jobs, we use Slack a lot, and we've started using the different colored like hearts to
Mm.
kind of express like that concept of like what am I feeling today, how how up or drained or whatever it is. So yeah, I think we as humans, we want to interact, we want to read each other accurately, and I think that's a very that comes into play a lot when we encounter people with mental illness or
Mm.
mental disabilities. That I think one of the reasons that has always culturally been so fascinating slash disturbing to us is that we can't read those people accurately.
No, absolutely. Have you heard of like memory neurons?
Oh, neurons specifically, like linked to memory?
Well, it's like memory neurons. So apparently, like why we're able to like try and understand the person in front of us as we're talking about this is through our memory neurons. So
Mm,
you know how they always talk about you're made up of the 5 people you surround yourself with. Well,
right.
what happens is that you're not only trying to, how you mimic behavior, like, let's say you're at a bar and you're sitting with a friend chatting, and she grabs her glass of wine. You'll automatically, after a period of time, whenever she grabs her glass of wine, you'll also do the same, even if you don't want to take a sip at that point. And so
Right.
we don't only just try and mimic, physical behavior. We also mimic thinking. So our memory neurons are trying to mimic or trying to understand subconsciously the person in front of us and trying to mimic their thinking and their behavior and their train of thought to us in our
Yeah.
own minds.
Yeah, that it's fascinating like how much we really want to interact, how we want to integrate into a group. And that was it's a it's a it's almost a human flaw like at some point.
That we're like not doing it. Sure, but it's just so interesting how like something we crave the most and we're seeking, and like even love, like why do we do, you want to be in love, but you want to be the closest you can be to another human being, but yet we're still disconnect, like we still almost don't know how to do that.
Yeah, there a kind of tangential example of that is something called acute aggression.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And usually we as humans experience it with animals. We see a puppy, and, we'll go up to the puppy and kind of like smush its face and, like interact with it maybe like a little bit roughly, like after we get excited up to a certain point.
Yeah.
And apparently the reason that we do that is because our brain can only tolerate like so much like love and affection to the point where it will actually blind us to taking care of the needs of that thing that we find cute or we want to give affection to. And so our brain actually has a switch where it switches to aggression because it kind of like calms our brain back down to be able to provide for the needs of that thing.
Wow, I did not know that.
It's a fascinating concept. So
we do that, I guess, with babies too, almost.
Yeah, exactly. It's like if we are too in love with that thing, like we won't take care of its basic needs, which is fascinating that like our brain has its own limiters to make sure we still survive.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, that's so interesting. It's almost like we shouldn't we shouldn't reach that like overwhelming level of love. Like we should take few steps back from that. Would you say that would be from what you just read, that study that you spoke about there?
Yeah, I think that it does kind of go back to balance. That in nature or with God or the universe or however you want to frame it, that like we do best in balance, not too much in love to the point where we don't eat or
we lose ourselves.
Right.
Yeah, like everything in moderation, I guess, like how they all say.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. No, that's super interesting. I really liked you sharing those points with me. I guess now we can read some of the responses where people shared their thoughts.
Yeah, great.
So our first response is from Aidan from Perth, but he's actually currently living in Amsterdam. This is what he said. In my case, I've discovered along with mental stimulus and sense of community is integral to my happiness. It's great to get a clearer physical picture of why I feel happier in the community as a result of pleasure chemicals produced in our bodies. As I'm a bookworm, it is ultra tempting to put off face-to-face interactions, though now I've realised this inclination I now have pushed myself to actively pursue more of that cafe time you speak of. The reason I left my job and went travelling was I wasn't happy. One reason was that social isolation due to remote work environments. Now I'm the happiest I've been in my life, working casually in Amsterdam. What are your thoughts on that response?
That is fascinating to me. That is fascinating, especially the remote work aspect, because that's something that I've looked a lot into. I'm also aspire to be more of a world traveler, and in my research on remote work, a ton of remote work communities have actually popped up all around the world. Like one of the largest is in Chiang Mai, and it's just fascinating to me that that type of travel can be very solo. It can be isolating in a way because you're going from country to country, your job comes with you. You don't necessarily have to have any ties. You're leaving your ties in your home country with your family and things like that. And yet still, like we seek out community no matter what. Like these very slick, posh centers have opened up for you to do your remote work in, so that you have a place to go to. You have people who are like-minded. You're finding, also the practical tools that you need, but a sense of community like on the road. So even the most isolating of circumstances still has us seeking out community. That's fascinating to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess my story, my path has been similar to Aiden, where I've left my job and like trying to, move to another country and so on. And it is kind of, when you come from other parts of the world, sometimes it's difficult to establish community, and it's something we're seeking all the time. Like we want more and more interaction, even though like he's as he mentioned, he's quite a bookworm as himself. Like he likes his alone time, but he's also, he was like, I need more of a sense of community. It wasn't my pleasure signals, as he mentioned, weren't being produced in his body without that sense of community.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's world travel is definitely kind of a double-edged sword. Like you are opening yourself to new experiences, but if you don't eventually like bring them back to your own community, it can feel you change as a person, and it can feel very, very isolating because you have grown and seen the world, and it's a hard thing to like have personal growth, but try to go back and like reestablish family ties or old friend ties when you've changed so much traveling.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely understand and relate to that a lot. Like sometimes, old friends that you've known for years, when you're growing and changing, and sometimes you go back to those friends like who are just talking about the same things or the same problems that they've been talking about for years and years and years. It's almost like I don't, you can't go back to it.
Right. Yeah. And I think that is one of the reasons that people travel continually or travel for work in the first place, is because they don't quite fit with that community. Like those people don't necessarily have that impulse to travel or see more or do more. And so you don't quite fit to begin with, but then when you come back, you really don't fit.
Yeah, that's so true. Exactly. That's a very true point. I guess like, when people do leave, and like myself and others, like, a lot of those people say, what are you doing kind of thing, if you're choosing to not just go for a holiday. So like you're trying to change, you're already different, and then you're changing even more away from that.
Yeah, it's even worse in America. We're lucky if we have 1 week, maybe 2 weeks of quote unquote vacation per year. So by the time, you actually travel to a place, you have like 5 days left.
Yeah, that's so true.
And yeah, so I even though America is very large and there's a lot to see within our own country, in some ways it's very homogenous, and you're not really like gaining much of an outside perspective.
Yeah.
And really seeing other cultures and how other communities live and is really important right now. That to me, and travel and food are one of the two most important things for building communities of the future.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Absolutely. Absolutely. Now we'll move on to response number 2. This is from Izzy from Singapore. I am more of an introvert, so I fall into the category of not realizing that I am disconnected until I leave a deep conversation with someone feeling fulfilled. I love how Callie mentioned that deep dialogues make her feel connected, because it does the same for me. On the other hand, I find myself leaving a conversation feeling even heavier than I was because I wasn't able to have a connection. A conversation needs to be vulnerable both ways in order for a connection to happen. What were your thoughts on that response there?
Yeah, that's a very multi-layered response. That's a great response. Yeah, I think that being vulnerable, I think, is even harder than ever before.
Why do you think that?
Well, in a social media world, sure. Even more than before. the appearance of things takes precedence over the depth or the nuance of things. And our interactions have been shortened to 140 characters a lot of times. I think about letter writing way back in the day, how you had to summarize, you had to, think through, you had to write down like a lot of your existence in a journal or in letters to be able to interact with someone far away. It was a lengthy, like in-depth, if somewhat one-sided conversation. But, and that's not to say that like all their interactions were very deep and meaningful, but it's become even easier to just kind of skim the surface of conversation, skim the surface of, like missing actual appointments. You can just send a text. Like you don't even have to call anyone anymore.
Do you think letters, even though letters were like disconnected, like I would love someone to handwrite me a letter. Like, I don't know, I'm very much about that, even though I'm from, I'm only 29. But would you say then, like, because the handwritten letter kind of was still impactful or felt connection because like you took more effort? Does it come down to effort? The more effort you put into something, the more connected you feel to somebody, even if it is a handwritten letter?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think there are still some mediums that afford us that if people are willing to do it. But yeah, I think just the physical act of like making sure, like forming letters, like we don't do that anymore. We don't write as much anymore. Also the like writing it versus typing it, where you can't just delete, like you actually have to consider what you're writing down, I think connects to a deeper place than just trying to type something. And maybe for some people that allows them to be more vulnerable. It at least, I would say, taps into that area where you could be more vulnerable because you're actually thinking and considering about what you're putting down.
Yeah, that's so true. That's so true. I always think sometimes I'm like, oh, I wonder if like, something happened and just the internet just was like cut out for a week. What will people do? Will they start reverting back? Will they write letters? Will they do things like that? And like, would that be good for us and beneficial to us? Just to like, I don't want to use the virus as a situation, but these, almost give it like a no internet virus and then see how we would, like this time right now has kind of made the environment better. Like there's a lot of cleaner air in lots of parts of the world because people haven't been driving their cars to work. And it kind of gave it like almost a reset. Like, do we need this kind of reset to, bring people closer?
Yeah, it's very interesting. One of my coworkers has children, and we were younger children, and we were talking about the differences of like how they occupy their time during this pandemic as to how I had to occupy my time as a child. And I think unfortunately we're just too far down the road of technology at this point, where if the internet completely shut off, I don't think people would know what to do.
Yeah, that's so true. So many will just be lost, though they won't. But maybe they will, like our natural human need. Like, I used to play outside all the time. Like I wasn't part of this technology kind of generation myself until I was in uni and we had to use it for like making projects and you had to get in groups, and the way to do that's when I got Facebook. I didn't have it before. Like all high school, all primary schools playing outside all the time. I think, your natural, human/animal instinct inside of you would to just be play or to be outside. If you don't have any of this technology, you'd want to play with others. Would we revert back to that naturality though? I wonder.
Yeah, I definitely think the older generations would, because they they understand a world that didn't involve that. But I do honestly wonder if the younger generations would I mean, I think we would adapt to it ultimately, but it would be an extremely
struggle.
Hard transition, because they just don't see the world in the same way. Like the in that conversation we were talking about my coworker's children, you know, the conversation revolved around do parents need to fill like every minute of their child's time like during this pandemic, and why? That seemed like a foreign concept to me, because it was just like, well, just go outside, like go use your imagination, go play with a box. I don't know what to tell
That's
you.
right. That's exactly right.
But,
there should be that space of just play. Don't fill it up. Just like let them be. Kind of like, they'll find things, like let their creativity, let their minds go.
Yeah, and the response kind of was, like, oh, they don't necessarily like go, or for her children specifically, like they don't go outside to quote unquote play necessarily, but they are using the internet for things that like never occurred to me as a child. Like they're on there watching like scientific videos about physics, or like learning a new language. So those are all very positive things.
Sure.
But completely different from like how I interacted with the world as a child. That would never have occurred to me.
No. I guess they say, like, with the technology that we have nowadays, like they say, I've read it somewhere on some scientific kind of video where they were saying how our grandparents reached a certain point in knowledge that we will reach a lot faster. So then our brains will expand a lot more because we do have the internet now.
Right. Yeah, and it's also a really big shift. Like we do not retain knowledge like they used to, because you don't need to.
That's true.
You don't need to remember phone numbers. You don't need to remember like
birthdays,
basic statistics, and
even birthdays. People don't remember birthdays anymore. Like, oh yeah, Facebook let me know it was your birthday. It's like, oh, okay.
Yeah, the most basic of interactions, like we don't have to hold in our mind anymore. Which I think is an interesting repercussion for how we gather, how we interact socially, like how we form communities, like because the basis is still there. Like we still want to remember someone's birthday. It's not like birthdays have disappeared.
No.
Or that,
but we don't put it to memory.
Celebrate. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, I get you. Yeah. A friend of mine, I was talking about this topic with her, and she was saying, she's like, she thinks that a person can be disconnected and still live a healthy life, because it's like an innate mechanism to protect themselves. Like she was saying, like a form of like self-regulation, but it like falls away, and you cannot shut life out anymore. So what will happen is what she was saying, that one of several things, that you can't like, you stop feeling anything from things like material things, and then like you end up like, you could get sick, or you start going to the drugs, or you have an affair, or things like that. And the analogy she gave, she was saying that, she's like, you start your life and you end up having this big lump sum of money in your bank account, and then you keep withdrawing from it every day. So you're living fine, you're living time, and then you get to a point in your 30s or 40s and it's empty. And then it's like, then you have to deal with it. So she's like, so a person could live a healthy life for a limit, then it becomes unhealthy if they're choosing to be disconnected from others. Yeah, I thought that was a really nice analogy there, and like it was interesting. I guess, I kind of agree with that.
Yeah, it's material possession is a very interesting concept, because other animals acquire things. They acquire tools. They acquire like birds acquire things for their nests and things like that. But we have taken it to such an extreme that I do think a lot of people use it as a way to substitute for meaning or connection in the world. And it's to such an extreme that it has just become ingrained in our culture. I had another coworker who is, considerably younger, and was asking in a roundabout way about, not fitting into the expectation of having children.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me aback slightly, because sometimes as you continue on your life journey, you just completely forget that there's this whole expectation of, you must acquire the car, you must, buy that house.
Yeah.
You must get married, you must live in this, heteronormative white expression that is the ideal of modern existence. And I think that this is where I would counter that, like, being away from community, being away from influence for a period of time is a very good thing, because I don't think that most people take a lot of time for self-reflection.
No.
And I think that impacts your relationship, your life course a lot. I know that both my husband and I took multiple years, away from dating and, seeking out other people to form a sense of self.
Yeah. Yeah, so you're right. You're right there. Connect with yourself first.
Mm-hmm.
Which we don't tend to do. Well, most people don't tend to do. They're so much trying to search and get to know somebody else, but they're like, well, you're not connecting with yourself. How will you build connections with what? Unless you know something about yourself to connect with.
Definitely. And it's a hard thing. It is not an easy thing.
No.
But it's absolutely necessary. Because like you said, we all have foibles. We all have ways where we're not perfect. And understanding how you interact with the world can really enlighten you as to, maybe why I was going to say why you don't interact well, but that's not true. I think it's why you miscommunicate with people.
Or deeply interact, or more than surface level interact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it really takes knowledge of yourself to understand how to deeply connect with someone else, because all the surface things are so open to misinterpretation that if you're really not able to explain yourself or explain your point of view or your way of thinking, you just won't have the tools to be vulnerable with confidence.
I like that. Be vulnerable with confidence. I really like that.
Yeah.
It's almost like, you can be. I think there was one moment in my life where, you can be strong and vulnerable at the same time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because it certainly takes strength to be vulnerable in the first place. That is an evolutionary button. We as our most animal selves do not wish to be vulnerable. We don't wish to be eaten physically or psychologically.
No. Yeah. Well, this was very interesting, Emily. Thank you so much for joining me on the cafe. This has been very enlightening for myself, and things you mentioned there that really just kind of I wasn't aware of, or just opened my eyes, or made me see some things a bit differently, and gave me some more perspectives, I guess. But yeah, so thank you so much for joining the cafe discussion.
Yeah, thank you. I had a wonderful time. It was really interesting topic.
Yeah, it was very much so. And listeners, you'll be hearing more from Emily in an upcoming podcast, so be sure to tune in for that.
Great. Thank you so much. I had a great time.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Get to Know You Cafe. If you enjoyed this podcast, rate, review, and share the podcast on Facebook or Instagram. You can tag me at Get to Know You with Tiffany Farag. Be sure to listen to Tuesday's podcast and send in your responses for us to include next Thursday on the Get to Know You Cafe to further deepen dialogue on this topic. If you have any topics you would like us to discuss, be sure to tag me in a post with your question. Join us every Thursday on the Get to Know You Cafe.